as a late 20 adult right now, I
Mhm.
kind of regret not knowing how to play or not learning to have played like piano or another instrument when younger,
Mhm.
because I want to be able to do it now.
Okay, yeah.
And doing it and learning as an adult to do that is really hard.
Mhm.
Um, and I would rather have been unhappy as a child being
Mhm.
forced to learn than being happy to learn as an adult, I think. Um,
Why do you think that is? Don't you like? Is it... Hello, Annadelle.
oh, sorry, I was on push to talk. I
Oh, there we go.
completely.
All right.
Um, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you great. What's up?
But the
Yes.
thing that I wanted to get into, there's actually a few things, but I'll just stick to the most recent thing that you had a discussion with Demon Mama
Oh.
on. I know. This is not actually in regards to what she was saying,
Uh-huh.
um, but just in to what my perspective or perception of the online left is in general,
Uh-huh.
where the argument that she, as well as others, will make is that there's when it comes to like education, that it's indoctrinating people into like a capitalistic society.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I feel like even if you grant that and you change the system to whatever the anarchist wants, that's not qualitatively different, I guess, because you're just replacing one ideology with another one. So you're still indoctrinating people.
Mm-hmm.
You're just indoctrinating them into anarchy.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how that necessarily would be a good argument against what's currently being done.
Okay, so the argument is kind of that like a school system will like it's impossible for a school system not to perpetuate some degree of like or some type of ideology. Um, and assuming
Probably.
in the mama's world it would be anarchism and yeah. So the issue isn't
Yeah.
necessarily with wouldn't necessarily be with the fact that it's indoctrinating people into like a specific ideology. It would be the indoctrination into the capitalist ideology, and then from there, instead of having the discussion on like specifically like indoctrination, you could have the argument on like okay, the broader argument about like capitalism versus like let's say anarchism.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, great.
Um, and the reason I'm thinking, well, I mean, I thought of this before, but I was recently reading a book. It's called Engineering Culture by um, Gideon Kunda, for people
Okay.
that want to know. It's kind of old, it's like 30 years old, but
Okay.
it's referencing how in the tech industry back in the 80s and 90s,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think this is actually permeated to all industries now, but there was a heavy emphasis on um, using work culture to direct people's behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you would see things like you want to be in love with the company, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the author argued that this is a form of control,
Mm-hmm.
which it is. And the author also did bring up Marx a little bit, which I
Okay.
disagreed with. Um, but the way it was, the author wasn't saying it whether it was good or bad. It was more of a question: is this a good or bad thing?
Mm-hmm.
From my perspective, if your workers are happy, it doesn't really matter what the culture is, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Like, or I should say, it doesn't really matter if a company is using their culture to like placate their workers, as long as like the actual individual feels like they're doing something meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
Um, whether or not that's true, that really doesn't matter to the individual
Yeah, I
from
guess
their own
that
perspective.
I would imagine the broader counter argument to that would be like kind of like it would be kind of similar to like a reformist versus like accelerationist argument where it would be like okay, sure, you know, you would have like decent like, you know, satisfaction right now at the moment with this like work culture or whatever. However, with like a more agitated, I suppose, workforce without this new company culture, then maybe you could accomplish like larger systemic changes that would like past that point give a degree of like worker satisfaction that is even more than what it was like at the time with the company culture as it exists right now, which most people are kind of like fine with or whatever, you know, learning to love your job or whatever.
I mean, sure, that's an argument that they can make, but
Uh-huh.
it's still entirely speculative. They have no evidence. Um,
That the next that the whatever the
that
systemic
that
solution would be better.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
there's or that I mean the way that Marx phrases it is that without certain conditions being met, people feel or become alienated from certain aspects of like their humanity or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And I don't think there's any reasonable amount of evidence either from sociology or psychology right now that
Mm-hmm.
would show that in uh, more socialistic or anarchistic um, society,
Mm-hmm.
with whatever values those entail, um, would lead to that not occurring anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so then it really does, to me, becomes an argument of like what values are important. Um, and
I
I
see what you mean.
don't necessarily know if, I guess, if we go with like the liberal values of capitalism, if those are inherently worse than the
Yeah,
values
so
of like socialism.
it's kind of like two examples, I suppose, of like micro arguments and how it could be more efficient to distill them into macro arguments. I guess, right? That's kind of like the overall message of
Yeah,
what you're saying. Yeah, okay, gotcha.
I think so at least.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a challenging argument to make. Because when someone like Demon Mama says, um, like indoctrination, I mean that's already a loaded term. So
Yeah, exactly.
she's trying to not poison the well, but she is trying to like direct people's thoughts to a certain predisposition.
Yeah, and you saw the
And
reactions like in that debate when I mentioned like, hey, maybe not everything that is taught is like necessarily bad. Like, how about keeping track of time? I think that's probably a
yeah,
decent thing. And then you got all the faces, and you're like, see, you're state brained. You have been propaganda brained, Rose. And I was like, okay. So I can only
exactly.
imagine if like that like broader argument if that would have been a successful one. But
And it's challenging. I mean, one, I don't think personally, I think the education system's pretty fine
yeah.
in terms of what it teaches. I think it could probably be taught differently or better. And I mean, obviously, there's always the edge cases where there's going to be some amount of people in any system where it's not going to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
I think we still have a way to go to like reach that situation where there's only like a very small margin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when that happens, that small margin could be helped with other means, typically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but
Yeah, I
like
guess.
in terms of like subjects, even back like almost all the subjects that are studied now, which is like what math, reading, uh, the sciences, that was studied by like Aristotle and Plato. Like
Yeah, exactly.
those weren't like capitalistic shills.
Mm-hmm. I guess it's
Um,
like the broader disciplinary things. I think that Dima Mama pointed out more so than anything else.
I could give my opinions of why Mama would point out certain things, but I'm gonna be nice. I'm not gonna cause
Okay.
any drama.
Let's try to focus on the
Yeah,
arguments and not why people might be making the arguments. Yeah.
but
Oh.
I don't know. It's frustrating because my personal background is I'm pretty well educated.
Mhm.
Um, I will be finishing my PhD in like 9-ish months.
Okay, that's that's
Um,
that's pretty is a bit of an understatement.
yeah,
I would say. I think that's
yeah.
what is that percentage of population that are PhDs?
I think less than 2%.
Okay, well, yeah, I think that qualifies a bit more than pretty educated, I'd say. But yeah, regardless, anyway.
And my specific focus is on science policy. So whenever
Okay.
I see policy discussions, I'm like, oh wow, something that's like somewhat related to me, but it never gets there. It's always the same, like poverty, racism, sexism. That's everything. Anything that relates to that gets like rehashed on Twitch,
Mhm.
and there's so much more policy that like actually happens in the real world.
What would you be interested in seeing more?
I mean, I would like to see more on education policy. That's the closest to what I do.
Hmm.
My specific work is I study what makes graduate students persist um, in their training
Hmm.
in the face of like overwhelming like depression, basically.
Oh wow, okay, that's a heavy topic, but yeah.
It's not like clinical depression, but it's like
Mhm.
if you
Burnout
like
more.
ever go on like Reddit and you like read like the forums for like grad students, it's
Hmm.
like the most depressing place you'll be in. Everyone will be complaining about how like their advisor never talks to them and how they hate um, their programs, but
Hmm.
they still stick through it. And I think
Hmm.
it's interesting to know like what is like motivating people to like, because being a grad student is probably one of the hardest and most economically challenging things someone can do.
Hmm.
And if you're a PhD student, you could easily get a job at a company
Hmm.
and you'll be fine, like financially, for like the
Yeah,
rest of your life.
you don't necessarily need the PhD for that many more opportunities when it comes to like employment and economic well-being. Is that kind of?
Yep, exactly.
I got
Um,
it.
And there's also a lot of PhDs like biology. I think
Mm-hmm.
something like 80% of them want to become professors and only 20% do. So there's like a
Oh
huge
wow.
mismatch between like their career aspirations and their like job outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's reasons why this happens. And it's all related to like science policy. In the US, the NIH funds
Mm-hmm.
a lot of research, and to have research done, you need PhD students.
Okay.
There's just a lot of
PhD
PhD
students
students
or
working.
people with PhDs?
Students. Well,
Okay.
I guess technically you can have postdocs as well,
Mm-hmm.
but to become a postdoc, you have to first have the PhD student phase.
Mm-hmm.
So to
I
have
see.
this funnel of students or funnel of talent,
Mm-hmm.
you there still needs to be the student at one point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course.
Even though I think when they get their job in the end, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times like the actual PhD training is not necessarily relevant.
So like, what is like the key? Do you have what's your like hypothesis so far for your study?
Uh, I think it probably has to do with regret. Um,
Oh, okay. Oh, I see.
yeah,
That's a rough one. But like, I've already dedicated. I'm already so far in. I can't.
yeah. I
Oh
mean, right now,
wow.
I mean, a lot of times, like for me, it's like, man, I wish I could be done right now, and I could. I have
Uh-huh.
enough skills that if I wanted to go work at like Facebook or Google, I could do that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I would have to like dedicate like probably 3 or 4 months to like interview prep,
Mm-hmm.
but like I'm talented enough,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd make a lot more money, probably like 10 times as much as I make right now. Um,
Okay, I see.
but I I put time in, and I'm
Uh-huh.
so close to being done. So it's almost like the sunk cost fallacy almost,
Uh-huh.
but I think it's a little different than that, because regret's something that you um, expecting to perceive in the future,
Mm-hmm.
um, and this also somewhat related to the the Demonology debate because I think as a late 20 adult right now, I
Mm-hmm.
kind of regret not knowing how to play or not learning to have played like piano or another instrument when younger
Mm-hmm.
because I want to be able to do it now.
Okay, yeah.
And doing it and learning as an adult to do that is really hard.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I would rather have been unhappy as a child, being
Mm-hmm.
forced to learn, than being happy to learn as an adult, I think. Um,
Why do you think that is? Don't you like? Is it that you principally? Do you think it's because you value no okay maybe that you think of like bad experience, not necessarily bad experiences, but not having fun as a child as less like severe than not having fun as an adult? Or do you think it's because the not having fun is the same, but on the aggregate you'll be able to, it will like outweigh itself like in the long term? Or like what's the kind of justification for that?
it's probably a combination of both. If
Okay.
I was to guess, um, or I guess it really isn't a guess. If you put in like a year's worth of like training on
Mm-hmm.
piano as like a 8-year-old
Mm-hmm.
versus as like a 30-year-old, the 8-year-old's gonna learn a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in that same with like the exact same amount of time spent.
Yeah.
Um, so even if you're both equally unhappy during it,
Mm-hmm.
um, and let's say there's a certain level of skill you need to reach to like be like to feel fulfilled in that skill,
Mm-hmm.
um, you'll still spend less time as a child being unfulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I also think adults are typically a little more well reasoned,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore they can plan for the future better.
Mm-hmm.
So when they are thinking about what they want to do, they're going to be spending a lot of time thinking about um, if that's like a good time investment.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the amount of unhappiness you get as an adult from an activity is probably higher because you're more aware of like what you could be doing instead,
Mm-hmm. I
if
see.
that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's like a compounding effect. It's like a valuing effect, and then it's like a measuring of like, okay, I think that the amount of like happiness I will have for the rest of my life by experiencing or enduring this level of unhappiness as a child will like drastically outweigh it. So it's like a combination of like those three things, I would say.
Yeah,
Okay, cool.
exactly.
Ah, it makes
Um,
sense.
but I think it's I don't know. It's just something that really bothers me with the online left, where they're placing like I think they're placed their values first in front of like reasonableness.
Mm.
especially with like children. I can't think of any adult that would say that they wouldn't make different choices right now.
Mm.
And I'm sure a lot of people would even say that they wish they was forced on them, um, so that they wouldn't have to worry about it
Yeah, exactly.
in the present.
Yeah. And I mean the reason for why a lot of people on the online have to do that is because like online and when it comes to audience and stuff, you're going to be beholden more to like a generalized, and that's kind of like what you can see like it tends to be like the people where you're kind of like, okay, like I know what this person's take on this is going to be. The people that are have like more like direct like strong like I would say not like strong values because I think that means something else, but like very like unilateral values that they like push on a bunch of things are generally going to be more like I guess successful because they're going to build it around, okay, I am the X values person, so because of that, this is going to be my like my general take on these types of issues, and you can always count on that as like a member of my community. And if you hold the same value, you can always count on receiving affirmation for your belief at this place, like from my content or whatever. um and that would probably be like my, I guess, hypothesis for why, or like at least one reason for why a lot of people on the online politics thing do the way they do when it comes to just like kind of like blanket slapping one form of like value or idea on like literally everything, whether or not it like belongs or whether or not it's the most reasonable thing to do in this situation. And
Sure, that's a lot more charitability than I would give. I
yeah.
go
Okay,
with
what would you say?
what's the law again? I'm not saying it's malice. I'm saying it's the other one.
Occam's razor, stupidity.
Yes,
Okay.
attribute stupidity where malice would otherwise be, right?
Uh-huh.
Um, so, although I'm not saying like stupid as in like incapable. I
Mhm.
just think people are allowing themselves to be too dogmatic,
Uh-huh.
and it's not necessarily their fault, because there's a huge psychological pressure for like um, in-group and out-group differences to be highlighted between people who perceive some amount of competition, I guess.
Mhm.
So it does make sense that people would potentially do this. It's just, I think, not good for discourse as a
Yeah.
result.
Hmm. Yeah. That
But yeah,
sounds like makes
I've
sense.
enjoyed talking. Eventually, if you ever get onto the neo pronoun things, I have gender takes as well.
Okay. Oh
But
yeah,
I'm
I've
not
had that.
gonna.
I have put that in like three stream titles, but I never actually got
Yeah,
to it.
I know.
Oh no. Oh no. Yeah, we'll see. Okay.
uh,
Um, do we have
but I
like a little? Do you think you have like a little teaser for your take on that? Just like one sentence to like grab the attention.
one sentence. Oh, that's
One
gonna be
sentence
hard.
is gonna be very hard.
I can give the psych perspective.
Okay.
I don't know the philosophy one as much. You'd have to go to like the silly serious for that.
Okay. Do
But
you know
this
what their take on neopronouns is?
actually I don't know. They probably think it's they probably don't think it's um useful from like a language perspective,
Okay.
which I would probably agree with.
Uh-huh.
Will they use them? Maybe. It's hard to. I mean, I don't. I don't know because I would assume so because Joe's a virtue ethicist, so she probably wants to like practice being like nice to people.
Mhm.
I take a relevance perspective where I'm not sure if we're necessarily obligated to like bend language so much to such a incredibly tiny proportion of people.
Mhm.
Um, but I also see the argument, well, if it's only like a handful of people, does it really matter? And who knows? It really depends. I would be amenable to like adding a pronoun for the general category of non-binary people. Um,
Wouldn't that be?
at-
Isn't that they them?
I did hear an argument that some people feel that they them is still somewhat gendered,
Okay.
um, from the perspective of it's being um, it's not used as a specific marker for a non-gendered group. It's used as a marker for an ambiguously gendered group.
Okay.
Um, so I think that's not a terrible argument for having another one, but I don't think there should be like 20 more.
Okay.
That would be like incredibly linguistically unnecessary.
Okay. I see.
But from like the psych perspective, and this gets onto like gender abolition,
Okay.
um, and that the way that we think gender arises is, have you heard of schema?
I've heard the word before, but I'm not quite sure what it means.
It's basically it's how people organize information or knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So when people learn stuff, um, like for chairs, there's like what the brain does is it basically coalesces all information about chairs into like a prototypical chair.
Okay, yeah.
And
Okay.
then
Mm-hmm.
when you think of chairs or
Mm-hmm.
when you see a chair, you'll have this like prototypical idea of what chairs can be or are,
Mm-hmm.
and you like there's like fancy math that happens with your brain,
Mm-hmm.
but it like measures like how similar like what you're looking at is to the category.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's similar, you're like, this is a chair. And when it gets like kind of like fuzzy, you're like, I don't know, this could be a chair.
Okay.
And then when it's like completely different, then like, nope, that's not a chair. That's actually this other category
Mm-hmm.
that you have information on.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, I've heard this before. Like uh, I think I heard in reference to Plato.
Wittgenstein,
I think.
or that as well. There's
Yeah.
Wittgenstein talks about this as well.
Vision says theory of
Um,
language. Yeah. Yeah. Well, how there's like there's like this kind of not idealized. That's the wrong word, but there's the idea of a chair. Sort of say, or like the perfect conceptualization of a chair, and then nothing in
yeah,
reality will ever perfectly um meet that character categorization. And as humans and as the way we use language, we kind of okay, is it similar enough, and then kind of go from there.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Um, for gender, and this is where I disagree with Dimama and Doe, and I'm more in line with Silly Serious.
Mm-hmm.
The way that, at least in the academic literature, it's referencing the categories of masculinity and femininity, and that's pretty consistent across fields. Um, Even with like non-binary, you're still somewhat you're not necessarily masculine or feminine. You
Mm-hmm.
might be neither or
Mm-hmm.
both. That's fine.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. But it's not an arbitrary category that you're in relation to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for how we think people acquire it, at least in the psych literature that I've read, um, people in ages like 2 to 4 are observing the social world.
Mm-hmm.
And what we think happens is, there's a testing this would be highly unethical, but it's
Okay. Yeah.
technically testable.
Uh-huh.
But people will like see, what we call men and women right now,
Mm-hmm.
and then they'll have like this schema of that appear
Mm-hmm.
like in their knowledge
Okay,
base,
and then they will have that to themselves. Okay.
and
Yeah.
then they have their own perception of what they should be based on like what they look like,
Mm-hmm.
um, and they have their personality traits.
Mm-hmm.
And for most people, you acquire personality traits that are similar to like your born sex,
Mm-hmm.
because we're socialized that way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and for trans people, what we think happens is you have your like perception of yourself,
Mm-hmm.
um, and you're measuring that against the male and female categories. And if you're like born male, but you're like, I don't know, my perception of self is like really far away from this category, and it's
Mm-hmm.
pretty close to this other category. There's a good chance you might identify as um, a trans woman in that case.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you like, maybe you identify with like neither category, and that might be non-binary, or maybe you identify with both a lot, and that could
Mm-hmm.
also be non-binary potentially. It's a lot fuzzier for the trans cases because psychology is heavily dependent on um, research subjects or
Mm-hmm.
participants, and there's just not a lot of trans people. Um, so most of the research is on cisgendered.
Individuals, yeah.
Yeah, but there's no reason to expect the brains, like the mechanism of gender, to differ between people, because that would be kind of weird.
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't like vision, speaking, hearing, touching is all pretty consistent between people.
Mm-hmm.
So the general assumption is almost any type of behavior, the mechanism that causes it should be consistent.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I've had a lot of people recommend that I check out Silly Serious and their opinions on a lot of the gender and these types of things. So I think I'm probably gonna do that, to be honest.
Yep, she's great. She's definitely more of an expert on the social categories of gender.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much she goes into the psychology of it, but from what I understand, there's not really any disagreement between like the philosophy of gender and the psychology of gender. It's just they focus on different things.
Okay. that makes sense. Yeah, interesting. I'm definitely gonna check out more of Sirius's stuff on this because it's something that I've been worrying about. That makes sense. The explanation that you talked about of the schema, and then I suppose it would be this would probably be like a collaboration then between the different fields of study, right? Because arriving at the 2 to 4 years that you mentioned there would probably be more of like a psychological endeavor, but the actual like conceptualization of like okay, like the schema of a gender and a mismatch and stuff like that would probably be like a more gender theory um or like a perspective
Yep.
like that. So that would be an instance where they work together in order to yeah, to come up with this theory. But once again, the issue seems to be that it is testable, but with ethical restraints,
Yeah. I mean,
to say the least. Yeah.
you could I'm sure you could imagine like, okay, if we do this and this to a child,
Hmm.
we can like try to like see how much this holds.
Yeah.
The issue is doing that to a child is
Is
highly
yeah.
suspect.
Exactly. It's kind of like it reminds me in some part of the kind of like race realist like testing for stuff like this. How we do have like a bunch of evidence. We do have a bunch of like research and whatever to pull from when it comes to understanding like our situation of it. But the only way that we would ever be able to get like 100% certain proof would be with very, very deeply unethical experimentation on like the same thing, kind of like very, very controlled environments with children. With a lot of children, would you probably need to be needed there, and yeah, so it kind of reminds me of that a little bit. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, and just a preface for anyone, I think most genders are valid, um, at least the way that's currently used. Um, feel free to express yourself how you do. With the race realist shit, they're stupid.
Then don't express. Don't, if you're
Yeah,
racialist, then don't express yourself at all.
yeah. Don't express yourself.
Yeah.
Um, Society's improving. I think over time, everyone will become happier and maybe more somewhat similar to each other in some ways, and but still with individuality in others. You know,
Yeah,
equal
that's
opportunity and all.
a good hope pill to end it on, unless you had something else in mind.
No, I think that's everything.
That's perfect. This is a
Um,
very nice conversation. I really appreciate it.
yeah, thank you. I can send you some papers on the psychological gender theory, um,
Yeah.
and I can send a link that to a Reddit thread that Joe has on gender theory that
Hmm.
she reads, um, that you might find useful at some point.
Yeah, sounds good. Just send it my way and I'll take a look at it.
Okay, enjoy the rest of your day.
Great. Have a yeah, you too. Have a wonderful rest of your day too. All right. Bye bye.